Well, first, thank you for joining me, Seli. It's wonderful you do this, and I appreciate you responding when I reached out earlier this year, trying to find people to share and talk about things with us. Your experience in history has been quite fun to watch. Your art was really amazing to see last year at the holiday, including the skirt that got pilfered before you could get a award, but I did see it worn too.
Well, I can't complain. I can't be for the state of the nation, so.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to complain about taking care of her now, isn't it? We're here in Puget Sound near Seattle. You're going to be out here in August, I understand.
Yes.
So we'll get a chance to pick on you when you're here as well. But there's more of us when the chief comes. You know how that works because you've seen it.
Yes, I work the check-in table, so I know how the counts go.
We're looking great forward to seeing you, and we're really appreciative of you sharing something that we talk about often in our own history, right? We know that turbans were worn, and then we kind of move on. We don't really talk about why, what brought it along, why it ended, and how to make them, what we think they looked like. And then when you said, well, I did that working at Sequoia's cabinet, like, well, that's the perfect thing to talk about because it's a blip in our own history when fashion statements for Cherokees were few and far between, right?
Yes.
So I've got you on the main camera. If you take it away, the meeting's yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you guys for hosting me today. This is my first virtual workshop, so if I stumble between cameras or anything, bear with me, but I'm gonna do the best I can. So, Salvador, Salonge, Gino. My name is Seli Stewart. My English name is Sarah. I live in Salsa, but I live in Tahlequah. Right now, I'm actually in the CCO office. I'm using the conference room. I've got a few different cameras set up so you guys can hopefully see better whenever I actually sit at the machine what I'm doing. But starting out with turbans, if you're a new sewer or if it's been a long time since you've sewn, turbans are the perfect project to kind of get back into the swing of things because they're very forgiving. There's not a lot of hard, fast rules about making a turban. There's more just general guidelines that you want to use. So first, I'll tell you guys a little bit about where we picked up the turban. 1700s, before we were really weaving cloth a lot. We were weaving fibers, but not making our own cloth. Most of our clothings were made out of buckskin, animals' furs, things like that. When the early colonizers, the English colonizers, would find Cherokee towns, they would kind of run them over. They liked our houses, they liked our farms, so they weren't always most respectful to the nation, especially early on. Well, eventually this led to 3 of our chiefs forming a delegation to go talk to King George III in England. Basically, he just wanted to tell his colonizers to be more respectful when they come into the Cherokee Nation. So we didn't have standard clothes then, so they were in buckskins, and a lot of our chiefs, being former warriors, would have their head shaved. They would just have one ponytail on the top called a top knot, and a lot of the times they would have tattoos all over them because they thought tattoos offered spiritual protection. So having a lot of tattoos on your head and neck was pretty common because that's really important to keep safe if you're fighting somebody, you want to protect the head. So these particular chiefs had a lot of head tattoos. And when they get off of the ship to start their negotiations with King George, the king's men saw them first and they're like, whoa, you cannot go in front of the king like that. You're going to scare him. He's going to be freaked out. Like, we got to do something to cover all that up. So England also has long relationships, colonization history with East India, actual India. So they had regalia left over from an East Indian delegation, and they dressed all of our chiefs up like this from head to toe in East Indian clothing. So they went before the king and made their negotiations, and King George actually agreed with us. He issued a proclamation telling his colonizers to be more respectful. He saw us as potential trade partners to work with. So when they went to go back to the Cherokee Nation, They gave back all the clothing, but they actually refused to give the turbans back. Simply, I've always been told, just because they liked them so much. So when they brought those back, it wasn't very much longer until we started getting spinning wheels. If you guys ever do get the chance to come out to Cherokee Nation, I highly recommend checking out Sequoia's cabin. I might be biased because I used to work there, but it is my favorite museum. And we actually still have Sequoia's spinning wheel that he and his wife Sally used themselves in the museum on display. So those spinning wheels, you could make fiber from animal furs. Then you could weave that fiber together to make cloth. Once we started manufacturing our own cloth, we started making our own turbans. So you didn't have to be a chief. It wasn't regalia. It wasn't something sacred per se. It was just a fashion item. But if you had one, that means you had access to a spinning wheel, you had the time to make it, or you had the funding to be able to pay somebody else to make them. So Sequoia is one of the most recognized people for wearing the turban because it was kind of like the height of the fashion in the early 1800s to mid 1800s when Sequoia lived. And he really wore that to show off that he was kind of a high status native, especially after we adopted his syllabary. He became pretty well known and well received. So I like to wear them because I have very frizzy hair. There was a time that I actually had like pink hair, purple hair, lots of crazy colors, which required me to bleach it. So when my hair got destroyed, I'd actually just shave my head. And I started wearing a lot of beanies. And I was like, well, I need an alternate beanie for when I want to dress up. And I started out with just using a scarf to wrap around my head, like someone here showed me that they had done. That is a really easy way to do it. You don't even have to be able to sew to be able to wrap a scarf around your head. And then that slowly evolved into me thinking, you know what? I can make one of these. So I don't obviously weave my own cloth first. That would make it a lot more difficult. If you're using a sewing machine, it's actually a really good project to get started out on. It helps you kind of get comfortable with the flow of your machine, learning little tips on how to keep things straight. And if it's not exactly perfect, that's okay because it's going to be twisted up and wrapped around your head. So traditionally, they were made out of silks and brocades because that was a fabric that you could weave. I really like to use like a medium weight cotton or like a duck canvas because then it's going to be machine washable. Brocade and silks you have to get dry cleaned. These I can just throw into the washer, so I kind of call them my modern turban. And there are tons of different things that you can do with them to accessorize them. Put a little turkey feather in, there you go. And this one is cotton, which is what I'm going to be working with today to show you guys. But really, you can make them out of any material that you can sew. This one is a silk. So before we get started, I am going to go over some helpful supplies. Also, if you guys have any questions at any point, feel free to interrupt me. I'm going to be using a fabric that I actually just got at Walmart. You can get these Better Homes and Gardens fabrics. They come in 2 yards pre-cut, and it's kind of that medium weight. And the reason I like it to be a little bit heavier than standard cotton is that really helps it hold its shape, but it doesn't, once again, you can use whatever you like. Also, the good thing about these, they're only about $10, at least here in Oklahoma. I'm not sure about inflation for Puget Sound area because I know it's a little bit more expensive to live out there, but they're about $10 and it comes with 2 yards. If you actually buy 2 sets of these fabrics, you'll have enough fabric to make 3 turbans the way that I make them. A few other supplies, you're going to want to have fabric scissors, or if you sew a lot, it's handy to have pinking shears. You can get these at Joann's Crafts. I think Walmart has them, Hobby Lobby, but they're just like scissors except for they have teeth. So when we cut out the edge, it's not going to fray as much because it's going to cut it on the bias both ways. I also like to use fabric chalk if I'm going to add any embellishments. So for example, on this turban, this is not folded, so you can kind of see what it looks like. I added ribbons. And to make sure I kept my ribbons straight, I just drew with fabric chalk a line across it, so I didn't have to pin a ton of pins on there. Whenever you're making it, it really is just like a super long pillowcase. If you can sew a rectangle, you'll be able to do this no problem. I like to hem mine on the ends just to keep it looking nice, but also if you want to hide it underneath where we wrap it around your head, it doesn't even actually have to be hemmed. It can be just a raw piece of material if you want. I think oh, last thing on supplies. Depending on what kind of sewing machine you have, your sewing machine may have an overlock stitch. I like that because then you can join it and have it cast to the side at the same time. An easy way to tell if your sewing machine has an overlock stitch, it's going to come with a foot that looks like this. This is my J foot, but overcast stitches, they have a little bar right here. If you don't have an overcast stitch, you'll still be able to do it. You just join the fabric with a straight stitch. And then I like to do a zigzag just to make sure it's strong and together. I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. Also on today's example, I'm going to be using a contrasting thread color. It's really just a design choice on how you want it. I chose to do a red thread with a blue fabric. That way, hopefully while I'm sewing, you guys can see that pretty easily. A lot of the times I'll use matching threads, so it's kind of hidden. But that overlock stitch, it's going to make a straight line going this way and also cast out to the side. And that just keeps it joined together to where it's not going to accidentally tear or anything like that. And it'll also help it not fray on the inside. So any questions so far? Does anyone, do that have a sewing machine set up there or?
Well, we have a couple setups. We're trying to keep up, but we're gonna figure you'll go through one first and then we'll drive ourselves crazy trying to catch up.
Oh no, don't worry. I also have some that I have in stages here, so I can kind of explain to you guys what we're going to do. So the average head is about 28 inches around. So to make sure my turbans fit everybody, I'm going to cut my fabric 30 inches across, which I'm going to walk through this and do this with you guys. So don't feel like you have to do it this second. I'm just going to kind of explain the process before we go. So this one, I didn't actually have 30 inches across. So what I did is I joined two pieces of fabric. So it would be that 30 inches around. If you make it 30 inches around, it's definitely going to fit over the head and you can just pinch anything that's loose to tie it. So that makes sure if you've got a small head, a larger head, whoever is wearing it, it should be able to fit just fine. After you cut your piece, I always do an overlock stitch on the hem because when we get ready to hem it, it's really easy to fold over and just keep it straight. Once again, I'm going to walk you guys through all this stuff. So if I'm using terms that don't sound familiar, just holler at me and I'll explain what I'm saying. So the length of it depends on, once again, how bulky you want it to be. This one, because I had this pre-cut fabric, I just left it at the 72 inches, which is the length of this fabric that it already comes at. For this one that I'm wearing right now, it's only about 56 inches because that's the size of my cutting board here. This cutting board, you can also get just at a Walmart or a Joann's, and they're generally only about $5. This is what the packaging looks like. And it's got all of your measurements on it. I'm rubbing it because it's on the other camera, but I don't know if you guys can see what I'm talking about. It's just a cardboard mat that has measurements on it. So that way, if you're making a lot of these, it can go quickly. These are all extra things that I would say you definitely don't have to have. I just have them because I make a lot of these. So If you want it to be extra long, I have a, oh, sorry guys, my camera holder thing is not cooperating with me. Okay. If you want it to be more bulk, then I'd say make it as long as you can, 70 inches, but also 50 inches is fine. Remember I said the average head is about 28 inches. If you have more than 28 inches of length, it's gonna go around your head. So it could really be as short as 36, just depending on how much fabric you have, which is also what makes this a great project because you can just put scraps together, whatever you have on hand, and make yourself a turban for pretty cheap. Also, if you get frustrated, you can just stop halfway through and wrap the loose fabric around your head. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started, which means I'm gonna have to put on my glasses. I didn't have them on because this horrible glare from my light. With most projects, before you start sewing, you're gonna want to wash and dry your fabric, as long as it's a fabric that you can wash and dry. Don't wash and dry brocade. But the cotton fabric, it's good to have it pre-washed because that will get rid of any possibility of shrinkage. Once again, because this is just a turban that we're wrapping around our head, if you haven't washed your fabric today, I wouldn't panic about it. It's not going to shrink too much in the wash, and the measurements that we use are generally a one size fits all. It's not as important for this as it would be if you were making like a skirt or a shirt. So I have this blue fabric today that I'm going to be using. And I'm just going to spread it out over my cutting board here. If you are anxious about being able to make sure you keep this straight, you can get just a wooden yardstick. I get them at like Lowe's and Tractor Supplies because they're cheaper than the plastic ones. They're like $1. So I'm going to measure out about 30 inches. So I'm going to start by measuring my width. So I'm going to go from the edge of the fabric. If you don't have fabric chalk, you can use a pencil. You can use a pen. I recommend a pencil because that graphite is going to wash out of your fabric, whereas an ink pen won't. But especially if it's a darker fabric, you can kind of hide that. But I'm going to use fabric chalk and mark 30 inches. And then I'm just going to go down the length of the fabric and continue marking 30 inches so I can draw a line and make sure that we keep this fabric straight. So now I'm just gonna connect that line that I made so I know where to cut. Now for mine, I'm actually making this for a smaller woman that I know, so I'm only gonna make the length of mine about 60 inches. You can make it as long as you want or as short as you want, as long as you have over 28 inches there. Now I'm going to use my pinking shears to just cut out this rectangle of fabric that I just drew on my fabric here. Ta-da! Here's my rectangle of fabric. Now, if you wanted to stop at this point and just wrap this around your head, you definitely could. However, over time, this end here is gonna fray. So that's why I like to make a finished hem. And actually the traditional turbans were like a tube of fabric. So just in case you guys don't have an overlock stitch, I'm going to show you how you would do this without an overlock stitch. So we're going to start by hemming both ends. The easiest way to do that is to use an iron. I'm going to go ahead and turn this on so it will start heating up. So I'm going to take the short end of my fabric and you're just going to fold it over about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to iron this down so that way we can just sew a straight line across it and have a nice hem for our turbans. I'm going to do that to both sides. I guess I could make this more on the iron. Now, if your machine has an overlock stitch setting, you also can just do an overlock stitch on the edge here and that will stop it from fraying, and then you don't have to worry about even sewing a hem. But this is what you would do if you wanted to add that hem. So I'm just folding it down about 1/4 of an inch and ironing it in place so I don't have to pin it. Also, the more that you sew, measurements like 1/4 of an inch will look more natural to you. You'll just be able to kind of eyeball it like I am right now. If you're not sure about it, don't feel bad about using your ruler to mark 1/4 inch and using that fabric chalk to draw you a line to make sure that you keep it straight. But once again, if it's not perfectly straight, you're really going to be fine. It's going to be wrapped around your head. It's not going to be that noticeable. So I ironed a lip down about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to go ahead and fold it one more time over itself so that fabric is basically wrapped up inside of there. I'll come closer when I get this ironed down. So now that I have this side ironed down, I'm going to go ahead and flip it to do iron down the other end. So once again, I'm going to take this end and just fold it down about 1/4 of an inch and use my iron to press that out.
Get this now. And do you guys sell turbans at Sequoia's Cabin that are pre-made? Or do you do any type of demonstration there about turbans?
I have done demonstrations for turban making there before, and I also, the issue about having a class there is there's not as much space for multiple machines to be set up. So I'll do demonstrations there, but when I'm doing an actual class, most of the time I'll have it at the prison museum because they have a classroom set up for me. But we actually don't have them in the gift shop. And not a lot of people make these anymore. So the only other person I have met who actually makes these besides myself is Troy Pody, the guy in the article with me in the Phoenix about them. And I don't know if he actually sells them or if he has just made them for himself and his friends. You can purchase a pre-made one from Crazy Crow, which is like a large supply vendor for a lot of native supplies. I used to get beads from there until I found somewhere local to get beads. But when you get them from Crazy Crow, they actually put it on a baseball cap and sew it down so you don't have to wrap it. Some people like that because the idea of wrapping it is intimidating to them, but they're really, really easy. I'm going to show you guys how I put them on also, in case you have questions about that. They're also really easy to sew. And if you get one from Crazy Crow, I think they cost around $90. Most of the time when I make these for people, depending on the cost of material, I can charge anywhere from as low as $35 to make it still worth my time of doing, or as high as like $60, $70, depending on, sometimes I get specialty fabrics that are more expensive per yard and stuff like this. But I do wish they would have some in the gift shop. I think that that's a good idea, but the museum technically falls under Cherokee Nation business, not Cherokee Nation, so they do what they want. So I'm going to show you an up close view before I start sewing this. See, all I did was fold down this first 1/4 of an inch, iron that, fold it again and iron that. One thing to watch out for when you're still new at sewing, you want to make sure your folds on both sides are going the same way. Keep your hems on the same side of the fabric. And now we're just going to do a straight stitch across here. So I'm going to move over, and you might want to switch to my camera with my sewing machine. Oh, I left my feed over here. Let me turn off the sound on this. Okay, can you guys hear me? Oh, gotta turn off the sound a little.
We can hear you, but you've got a good echo.
Let me turn this. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. So an overcast stitch is gonna look like this. If you don't have this setting on your machine, my machine is kind of fancy. I got a nice one so it could do embroidery, but it just has a menu here of what kind of fabrics you're using and what kind of stitch you want. So since we're using a cotton, I'm going to use a cotton woven setting. It's a lightweight, so I'm going to use A. And then I'm just going to do a straight stitch. That way, if you don't have an overcast stitch, you'll know how to do this still. So a straight stitch, I'm going to put on my A foot like my machine tells me to do. Pop my foot in place. And now we're just going to sew down our hem with a nice straight line. Now, a couple of just sewing 101 tips. If you find yourself getting a bunch of thread caught up underneath whenever you start, it's because this tail is getting tangled in your machine. So with your tail, I like to just put it right to the back there to make sure it doesn't catch as I'm sewing. Another beginner tip, I always keep this piece of tape on my machine here. If you put it down, it's very easy now for me to see where I need to hold that fabric to make a straight line. So I'm just gonna keep that fabric even with the edge of my tape here. If your machine does not have a start-stop feature, whenever you start sewing, your thread can come out if it's not locked in place. So what a start-stop feature is, all it's doing is it's making 2 stitches forward and then 2 stitches backwards. Every machine will have a reverse option. So if you don't have a fixed feature, you're just going to do 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back. And that will lock your thread into place before you start sewing. Now we're just going to sew a straight hem here. When you get to the end of the fabric, that's when you're going to want to use either your start stop feature again or 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches backwards to keep that thread locked into place. And now you can see we have a hem going across here. I'm doing this pretty quickly and also with this camera in front of me, so this is not perfectly straight, but you will see when we're done and I put it on, it's really not going to be super noticeable. That's why I say this is a really good project for beginners because it's really forgiving if you aren't perfectly straight. So now I'm just going to flip it over and go to the other side where my ironed hem is and sew this down. Oh, and I pulled my thread out. So I'm going to thread my needle first. I need to get some scissors. If you're new at sewing, threading your needle is a lot easier with like a fresh cut. See this little curl on the end there? That would be a nightmare to thread. So I just cut it off and start with a fresh piece of thread. Also, a lot of sewing machines have automatic thread cutters. If you've got a little thing next to your needle, that's what that is. I don't like using them, so I don't. I just thread it myself. But as you sew more, you'll learn what's comfortable for you and what features you like in your machine and how you want to approach it. So once again, just a straight stitch across this hem. So now we have hems on both ends of our machine. And now I'm about to, you might want to change to my camera where you can see my cutting board so I can lay this out and you guys can see that. Okay, now I'm over here. So I've just laid this out on my measuring board. And now all we're going to do with your hem facing inward, so we want it to show, we're going to fold it in half. So the lip is on the outside. I'm going to bring these two sides together and then just start pinning it where the opening is. And we're just going to go down the whole length of the fabric and pin it together. Because I'm not adding any kind of like ribbons or embellishments, if it's not perfectly lined up, it really won't be noticeable. If you have ribbons or something on there, you're going to want to make sure both sides, the ribbon here and the ribbon here, are lining up as you pin it together. So another little pro tip, when you're pinning, it took me a while to get this in my head when I first started sewing. You want to think about how you're going to run this through the sewing machine. So I want all my excess fabric out to the side of my sewing machine so it doesn't bunch up in the neck. So I put my pins facing this way where the little ball is down, so that way I can take them out as I go. So all I've done is just pin together down the length of this. You don't have to use a lot of pins. Just keep it where it's relatively straight. And now I'm going to go back to the sewing machine. Also, I hope no one asked any questions in that last part because I forgot to turn up my volume. So if you guys said anything to me and I didn't respond, I promise I wasn't ignoring you.
Oh, we're all busily taking notes.
Okay. All right, so once again, I'm going to show you how I would do this if I didn't have an overcast stitch. If you do have an overcast stitch, you're just going to want to overcast to join it. If you don't, what we're going to do is go a straight stitch all the way down the length of the side. And then when we're done with that straight stitch, we're going to come back and do a zigzag on the inside. That will make it to where it's joined together really strongly and to where you don't have as much issues with fraying once you start washing your turban. So I'm going to show you guys what I mean by forwards and backwards. I turned off my fix feature. Just once again, if your machine doesn't have that, you're just going to put it underneath here. I still have my tape on here, so that's what I'm keeping my fabric aligned to. I'm going to use my wheel on the right of my machine to make 2 stitches forward. Then I'm going to turn on the reverse feature. Some machines, it's not a button, it's a lever, and you just hold down the lever, but I just press this button and now it's going to do 2 stitch backwards. And now my thread is locked into place. So I'm going to turn off that reverse so it will start going forward again. And now I'm just going to sew a straight line to the whole length of this turban. As you sew, make sure you're pulling out these needles. If a needle hits your needle on your machine, it can break your machine needle, which they are replaceable. Also, some people will pin horizontally this way. That way the needle is less likely to hit it, but I always just say, just take it out. Also, when you're sewing, if you need to, sometimes I won't even pin this, I'll just keep the fabric lined up as I sew. If you're gonna stop for a second and move your fabric around, I always recommend parking your needle. And all that means, when you see that, when someone's talking about sewing, take your wheel on the right side of your machine and lower the needle into the fabric. That's what parking your needle is. That way, any way I move this, it's not gonna mess up. It's gonna hold me where I'm at, so I know where I need to line up. Also, if you're new at sewing, don't feel like you have to go as fast on your machine. You will get more comfortable with controlling the foot pedal speed the more that you do this. I've just done this a few times, so I can go pretty fast on a turban now.
Practice definitely would help.
It's kind of like riding a bike. If you've done it before, it will come back to you, but you will definitely not be popping wheelies if you haven't been on a bike in a few years. When you're sewing, the main things you want to avoid is sewing a wrinkle into the fabric. So like if I had it bunched up like this, you don't want that, which is why it's helpful to kind of pin stuff beforehand. But with these turbans, once again, if you sew in a wrinkle or something like that, it's really going to be hidden once you put it on. Obviously, I say strive for the best that you can do because it just makes for a nicer product, but don't feel like it's not wearable or that you have to stop and tear your stitches out. Like, this is why these are such a great starting project, because they're so forgiving. But now that I've gotten almost to the end of my fabric, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the reverse to do a few back stitches. Turn it off and go forward again. So that way my thread is locked in place. So now I have a straight stitch down the open side of the whole length of fabric. Now you could just leave it as a straight stitch, but that kind of leaves you vulnerable for wear and tear. So let's say I throw this into the washing machine with something that has buttons or hooks or something, and the other thing with hooks catches on this thread. Well, if that thread busts, now you have a hole in your turban. Not the end of the world, you can sew it back together, but so we make this straight stitch just a little bit stronger, I'm going to change my machine to a zigzag stitch setting. And now I'm going to do my zigzag right on the outside of where that straight line is. Also, the nice thing about overcast is this is basically an overcast stitch in 2 steps. If you have an overcast stitch setting, you can just run down the length of your fabric once and then you'd be done. But I started out sewing on a Singer machine that I got from a Goodwill for $50. So if you're just starting out, no shame on getting something that's not as high end or has those extra fancy stitches. A good way of making sure we're right on the outside, I like to sit my presser foot up, and then I just go ahead and lower the needle slowly until I can see I'm right on the outside of that straight stitch. I know that you guys probably can't see as well as I'm on Zoom, but you can get up close to your machine and look right underneath your foot and see that you're exactly where you want to be. And now I'm just following along where my straight stitch is, adding that zigzag right to the right of my straight stitch. I'm going to use my stop feature. If you don't have one, do the forwards and backwards, make sure that that's locked in there. And now I'm just going to cut my thread to get it off the machine. These little tails, I'm just going to trim. And now you can see along this straight stitch, I have this zigzag. That's going to keep it together nice and strong. I will also stop. You see how it's already frayed some? It's not going to fray anymore past where that zigzag is. So when I go to wash it, it's not just going to slowly come apart. Okay, I'm going to switch cameras one more time. Okay. So now I just have, basically it looks like a very, very long pillowcase. And I'm going to turn it right side out. So anytime you sew together a garment, it should be inside out when you're done. So I'm just going to turn it out. Back so you can see. Ta-da! We have a turban. Do you guys want to see me put it on my head, or do you want me to use one of my styrofoam heads? Anybody got a vote?
Well, let's pick it on you because it's.
So they can do it themselves?
Yeah.
All right.
Besides, foam heads always argue.
Well, and honestly, those styrofoam heads are a little tricky because styrofoam is a lot more slick than my head. So I'm just going to take this one off. Also, taking this off will show you what I mean by a good structure. So that medium weight cotton that I'm using, when I take it off, it actually holds together pretty well. Wanted to, I could put it right back on. If you have something like silk or brocade, it's probably gonna come undone when I take it off. So to wrap a turban, you're gonna pick one of the open ends and we're just gonna put it on your head. Like it is. Now, because I make mine 30 inches, it's quite a bit bigger than my head. So what I'm gonna do is just pinch the fabric in the back, have it tied on my head. See, it's like a super long pillowcase on my head. Then I like to put it over my right shoulder. I'm right-handed, so it might be easier to put it over your left shoulder if you're left-handed. And just kind of look at how you want it to lay. And keep that excess pinched right here. You're going to start twisting your tail. After you've got a good bit of it twisted, I don't have it all the way twisted, it's just a good portion of it. You're going to start wrapping it. So we actually did not have a word for turban. We called these wrapping hats because you literally just wrap it. So once I'm around the back, where I have it pinched, I can use my tail to kind of go over that pinch, and I'm just going to hold it tight in place. So I'm going to twist the rest of this end, and then you just tuck it into your wrap. And ta-da!
So cute.
I also like having the wrap ones over pre-sewn ones. So some people will essentially make this, and then they'll take a baseball hat and they'll cut off the bill and sew it down to the hat. That's how the ones from Crazy Crow I was telling you about come. But I really like the process of putting them on. I actually used to do pediatric therapy before I went into the arts and got this wonderful job. And a big part of my therapeutic process that I would recommend is something called mindfulness, which is really just being grounded and in the moment. So when I wear a turban, I actually like to take the 5 minutes in the bathroom, in the mirror, whatever I'm using, to try to be present in the moment and just describe feeling, you know, like when I'm doing something like this. I've gotten a lot better at speaking in front of people, but even still, especially this being the first time that I've done it on Zoom, you know, you always have a little bit of nerves. I find if I take the 5 minutes to just describe what I'm physically feeling, being present in the moment, it kind of helps ground me and makes it a calmer, smoother transition. So I like to give them to people that they have to wrap and say, the 2 minutes that it takes you to wrap it, just be present in the moment and ground yourself, because we don't always take the opportunity to do stuff like that these days. So does anyone have any questions, comments, anything that I said that you didn't understand?
Excellent teacher. We're all rebels. Thank you. What a.
Hoa. This is much easier than teaching. I've done ribbon skirt classes, which I'd be happy to come out and do for you guys, but I will never do a skirt class over Zoom. No way.
More difficult, yeah.
When you use ribbon, when you're putting the ribbon on, does it, the direction that you go, how will it look once it's wrapped?
It will change the way that it looks, which let me show you on this one. So that's a good thing to bring up because, oh, I have it inside out now. Another thing to think about is the fact that part of this is going to go on your head, which once again, there's no wrong way to do it. Cherokees are allowed to be contemporary people. I've had people ask me, can women even wear those? Even though it wasn't typically a women's fashion, we're allowed to be contemporary people. If you make something and you're a Cherokee person, then it's Cherokee art, it's Cherokee clothing. It's, you know, we're allowed to move forward. But when thinking about adding those styles on, part of it is thinking about how much is gonna go over your head. So remember, a big section of it is just the tube on our head. Let me get my dummy guy to show you. For this one, I measured down about 14 inches because I knew I didn't want the ribbons on top of his head because that's going to be mostly covered. So I measured it down so that way this part that goes over his head, I don't have any ribbons. I did these ones horizontally across it. If you have different types of fabrics to join together or do ribbons vertically, it's going to change the way that it looks. So I will put this on this guy so you guys can see what this looks like.
And I saw you had a feather in the one you just moved out of the way.
Yes. I actually, it's not attached in any way. This is just Tam. Do you guys know Tammy?
Yes.
Tammy, my coworker. Her husband hunts and he caught a turkey a couple of weeks ago and she was kind enough to give me the wings. So I'm actually working on trying to make a feathered cape, but any kind of feather you can just actually stick in where you have the wrap. So like I could put it going downward on mine here too.
A feathered cape, that's a hard thing.
Yeah, it's my first time trying that, so we'll see how it turns out.
A unique challenge.
Yeah.
So because I have them lower and they're vertical, they're gonna show up as little horizontal stripes in the part that I'm wrapping around his head. If you had them vertically, they're gonna be going.
Kind of a diagonal.
I didn't do a great job wrapping it. So another thing that I like to do, like I was showing you guys earlier, is joining different types of fabrics. I'll put this one on for you guys so you can see what that would look like. This is also not actually sewn together. So if you just have like a scarf that you really like, that's got a good length to it, you can still use it as a turban. You're just gonna lay it over your head like this. Take my tail over my right shoulder. And now as I twist this, you can kind of pull the different sides of the fabric forward. So you have both of them showing. And then just tuck your tail in wherever you can get it. I didn't twist it. So now you have different mixes of the fabric kind of popping out in different areas.
I like that.
It's also really fun. I tend to fall into a lot of themes. I like fabrics that have syllabary on it, special like Cherokee prints and things like that. So any skirt that I'm making, every scrap of fabric I always save because you can just, you don't have to just join your fabrics side by side. You could have strips going down like this. I mean, you can really get creative with it. The possibilities are really fairly limitless just on how much time you want to spend doing it. Oh, my first one.
Well, no.
How
Well, you made an interesting point. I've never really thought of turbans as a conspicuous wealth, a showing
Yeah.
of having that ability, the profitability, the tools or.
So
time.
some other notable Cherokees, if you guys ever get the chance to come here and visit our history museum. So Joseph, you probably get to see it when you're here for a conference. George Lowry, he was one of the chiefs that actually Sequoia had to go before for trial because he was accused of witchcraft whenever he first made the syllabary. And there's actually some famous paintings of George Lowry, and he has a turban on. He also has some pretty cool body modifications. Spring Frog. I mean, a lot of chiefs would wear them, but because they generally came from like higher status families, they had access to people who were willing to make trades with them or things that they could give away in exchange for clothing. Because especially when we were still working off the sewing wheel, before you could even get started to the point of cutting, you would literally be making every fiber, then weaving every fiber together, which is also why they used a lot of brocades. Because brocade, when you weave it, you can make some really beautiful patterns in the actual weave of the fabric. So it's kind of extra nice, extra special. So if you had one, you definitely were somebody that had some status or had some, good relations with people who are willing to give you that.
Well, thank you so much for that. That's a unique thought I hadn't had before.
Mm-hmm. So I like to wear them and be like, yeah, I'm a high status Cherokee. You're just kidding. I'm an average Joe, but but I do think that they can be cute. I like to wear them with ribbon skirts specifically because I kind of already mixed more masculine and feminine clothing just in like normal wear. So I think that that's kind of a fun way to bring that into my Cherokee heritage. I'm a little bit of a tomboy, but I also like to look a little nice sometimes. So mixing those two traditionally feminine and masculine fashions, I think can have a really interesting look.
Indeed. Okay, we're gonna dive in and see if we can sew our fingers together.
Okie doke.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we or do you want to watch us all be silly?
I don't mind hanging out. I'd probably mute my microphone. That way, in case you guys do have any questions, I'd be happy to answer whatever kind of tips I can give for sewing. But once again, just go with it, embrace any mistakes, use it as a learning experience to get comfortable with your machine. And thank you guys so much for hosting me. I'm so glad that I get to do this now for my job. So
Thank you so much for coming.
hawa, happy sewing.